Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Happy Thanksgiving, American listeners, those of you who are listening in close to real time. I'm trying to take this week easy, but it's a relative thing for me. Speaking of relatives, we will not have any of them over for Thanksgiving this year. Not that we're trying not to, but, instead it's going to be friends, old and new. So I'll fill you in on that stuff next week in case any interesting stories come out of it. But meanwhile, let's dive into this week's podcast. My guest this time around is the cartoonist Matt Madden, who has a brand new book out called Ex Libris from Uncivilized Books. Ex Libris, I've struggled with how to tell you about it. It is the story about a person who finds himself in a closed room with a bookshelf that only contains comics and graphic novels. And they recently bottomed out, and the room is their choice to represent a new start in their life. Only thing is, the bookshelf beckons, and they start exploring the comics. And they're a comics newbie, and as they start reading, they get drawn into a sort of scavenger hunt of meaning, because the comics begin speaking to the narrator's own experience. Even as they jump from book to book and genre to genre, the echoes start getting more and more resonant, even as we as readers are exploring more and more interesting forms of comics in the process. I'm being a little vague here, or I'm making it sound like a Twilight Zone episode where the person's story is in the books that they're reading, but Ex Libris is a much more profound experience than that. Over the course of the book, Matt really explores comics as a medium, using different visual and storytelling styles for each excerpt, along with the framing sequence of the narrator in the room. And in the process brings the reader deeper and deeper into the possibilities of what comics can do. Now, the immediate literary comp for this is Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, but this is not just a, comics version or comics adaptation of that, because comics are inherently different than prose, or different from prose, and Matt takes full advantage of the form here. And, still, I'm a guy who came up on that sort of postmodern fiction, so I'm clearly the target audience for Ex Libris, but I contend that it's something that's really open and accessible to someone who isn't me, which, the reason I could say that is that Matt manages to achieve something that a lot of the postmodern experimental fiction that I used to read never really did. In Ex Libris, he gives the reader a legit story, building the narrator's tension and anxiety as they fall deeper into the comics library, giving you a reason to care about this narrator as a character, and ultimately coming around to a neat payoff. As a corollary to that, I should say that experimental fiction can have certain connotations along the lines of you need a PhD in semiotics or comic studies to read them. In this case, you don't. Like I say, it is an entertaining book that'll make you consider what comics are and what they can be, while still, engrossing you in a story itself. And in the process, Matt does a fantastic job of varying his comic styles and ultimately building a sort of alternate history of comics that put me in mind of Dylan Horrocks's great work, Hicksville, which I've talked about at length on this show before. So anyway, Ex Libris, it's out today, November 23rd, 2021, for you time travelers out there, from Uncivilized Books. It's really, really good, really thoughtful, gorgeous to look at, something that can only be a book, which we talk about during the conversation. Doesn't work as a PDF. It's not even available as an e-version. And that's all for the best. You need to hold this book and understand, what happens from page to page and panel to panel in a way that the screen just doesn't do. All of which is to say, it's a book that loves the comic form and Matt's love of comics really comes out over the course of this. Now, here's Matt's bio from the book. There's a longer version at his website. Matt Madden is a cartoonist, teacher, and translator. His best-known book is 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercises in Style, a comics adaptation of Raymond Queneau's Queneau. I screw up French pronunciations all the time. Exercises in Style. His recent work includes the comic books Drawn Onward and Bridge. He has been living in Philadelphia since 2016. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Matt Madden. Tell me about the origins of the book and how the gestation and the execution went for you, which are two very, very different things. But yeah.
Well, I'm actually preparing for a small exhibit here in Philadelphia at a shop called Partners and Sons, which is a combination art comics shop and contemporary art gallery. Mm-hmm. So I've been going through my art boxes with them, picking out, because we're going to show highlight some process, not just sort of the final pages, but like sketches and layers of tracing and, redrawn stuff. And I found one of my original outlines for the basic story structure, which was from 2006, I want to say. And the nub of the story goes even further back to probably sometime in the mid 90s, when I was, first trying to make comics and come up with ideas of stuff to do. And around that time, I was also reading a lot and going to see a lot of movies and stuff. I read Italo Calvino's book, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, for the first time.
I was assuming that was the real origin point, was getting infected by that book.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I've always liked, playful works of art and works of art that, reference themselves and, get into kind of turtles all the way down, recursive loops. And that is definitely one of the great ones. And I liked that aspect of it being a book about itself and a book about books. But I also loved the expansive sense of imagination and possibility that it generates by giving you the first chapter to all these novels, which you think are the new Italo Calvino novel, and then turn out to be some mistaken thing, and the rest of the book is missing and all that stuff. So the combination of having a kind of mystery novel, detective novel kind of structure with these like glimpses into impossible potential fictional worlds, I found very, very enticing. And not, I've talked to friends in the past who think, I like that book, but I just wish he would have picked one of those novels and told the whole story. And,
yeah.
I can understand that frustration. And there's maybe for some readers a sense of a kind of cop out that you're kind of like generating the idea of a world and then not following through on it. But I also feel like, and this is another touchstone for this book and my work in general, is Jorge Luis Borges and his whole idea of the Library of Babel, which I only recently, this idea of an endless library that has every possible permutation of every book you could imagine. And reading it when I was younger, I thought, oh yeah, cool. The potential. There's so many possible books out there. Then it's, imagine having a library like that. But then someone else recently, I was reading about it and was like, no, it's a nightmare vision. It's the idea that there's no end to the stuff you have to read and no way to figure out which one's the right, authentic text and so on. So viewed from that angle too, I think to think that Calvino, in the case of that book, or me in Ex Libris, should have picked one fragment and expanded into a graphic novel. What do I do then? Spend the rest of my life trying to flesh out every single idea I had in that book and every other sketchbook? You can't do that. And a structure like Ex Libris, and working under Calvino's guidance, gave me this way to throw a bunch of cool ideas, some of which frankly aren't necessarily a book length idea, but they have a spark in them that is shouldn't just sit in a sketchbook somewhere either. So it's the fact that I could have this story structure that, like Calvino, has this sort of almost mystery novel thriller kind of thing, as the reader is trying to figure out what these comic books are that in this room that they're in. Gives me an opportunity to throw a whole bunch of ideas in there, that some of which are very important to the moving ahead of the plot of the book. Others are just kind of fun, like what if sort of scenarios, like creating imaginary authors and so on. So,
yeah, how tough was it for you balancing the experimentation and the formal aspects of this, and the need for a legit narrative, a plot, as you said, because it's too easy. We know it's too easy for these things to devolve into, well, to go up their own ass, basically.
Yeah.
To put it in common parlance. But how tough a balancing act was that?
It was never too hard, to be honest, because I find that's kind of where I live, is in that middle zone between formal experimentation and traditional storytelling. As much as I like to kind of explode the medium and investigate, take it apart piece by piece and look how it all fits together. I also value, traditional storytelling and the thrill, the fun of reading, of getting absorbed in an adventure, becoming familiar with a new world, and kind of moving through it, and having that whole immersive environment. And I always, and sort of one bet in all of my work, I think, and Ex Libris is maybe the most extreme, parry on it yet, is that you can do both at the same time. You can have a very self-aware, critical book that's about reading. It's about the history of comics. It's about how comics work, how words and images interact, and so on. While at the same time, creating this compelling story that is going to draw you along and want to kind of turn the page and see what happens next.
Hmm. Yeah, but again, that idea of making a satisfying story with all those elements has got to be a challenge of sorts. But when you mention the tinkering and taking things apart like that, did that predate your comics interest? Where did tinkering begin for you, I guess, when it came to breaking down narrative and story elements? Do you remember I never used to look at things like this, but then I started taking them apart.
I think it's an inclination. It's sort of a tendency that I've always had. I'm trying to think what the earliest memory I might have, and it's probably just as a kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old. My parents used to have all these collections of Bernard Kleiben's, B. Kleiben's comic books, comic strips, the Cats books most famously. And I always loved the really meta. He had a bunch of strips that were like comments on the cartoon and comments on drawn, the fact that these are drawings. And there's one that I actually have a little reference to in my book, which is a couple, sort of kind of lumpy couple in a little house in the suburbs. And they're both holding word balloons. And one is a traditional, cartoon word balloon. The other is all like hacked up and taped together and looks like shit. And the wife is holding that one up, and it says, "This one doesn't work as well as the old one." And if you look at the old one, it also says, "This one doesn't work as the old one." So it's this sort of like kind of paradoxical, very funny image that is like kind of silly and funny, but also is like deconstructing the way cartoons, the way comics language works, and word balloons in particular. So that was like very early on. That kind of always appealed to me. I think when it started to solidify was probably that as an undergrad, I migrated a bit. I started in linguistics, and I ended up transferring to comparative literature. And I had a first, intro to comp lit class where we really got into exploring the form underlying story structure in a kind of structuralist way. Not too much in the sort of, this was in the height of French theory and stuff, and I was exposed to a bit of that as I went along. But this was a bit more really just looking at the text directly. And we were reading, that's where I first read Borges. That's where I first read Julio Cortázar, who's another big touch point. Sure.
Hopscotch, I'm assuming. I mean, at least as a launching pad, but yeah.
Well, yeah, no, initially, actually, the short stories in particular. Yeah. Unfortunately, I know Spanish well enough that I feel like if I'm going to read Hopscotch, I need to read it in Spanish. Yeah. And to do that, I need to go spend at least 6 months living in Buenos Aires to be able to, grasp it, I think. But But no, the short stories, we read, like in Complet, we read the story Las Babas del Diablo, with the Devil's Spit, which is the basis for Blow Up for the Michelangelo Antonioni film. Mm-hmm. And so we read that and watched the movie. And actually, that one comment that my professor made, Stuart McDougall, long retired, I'm not even sure if he's still alive, but he pointed out something really cool, which I definitely directly influenced Ex Libris, which is that in Antonioni's film of Blow Up, the character Dave, played by David Hemmings, who's this sort of like fashion photographer and swinging in London, he's got this really cool and kind of seemingly sprawling, endless loft in London, and he's in Soho, I guess, and he's bringing models over, and then he's got a family in there somewhere, and there's all these like ramps and things like that, long hallways, and my professor pointed out that house is not a real house. It was actually shot on like 3 or 4 different locations, and it was just spliced together in editing. So it's a completely fictional, hypothetical space. It's not a real space. And I thought that was really cool. Again, it's that idea of the possibility of what you can do with art, of the kind of illusionism, kind of self-aware illusionism that art pulls off, that really appealed to me.
Mm-hmm. And to get back to that question about gestation and execution,
mm-hmm.
Finding the outline in 2006 versus what Ex Libris ultimately became as a finished book, how closely did it hew to that? Do you find that you stuck with, the idea that you had back then, or did things diverge?
Pretty closely, to be honest. I mean, a lot in the detail, a lot of fine things changed. Sure. And certainly, like, as always, the ending, is always the hardest part, I think. But I did have a basic story. I had the basic concept of this character who's locked themselves in a room, and there's nothing in there but a bookcase full of comics. They start to read through them and are trying to figure out who put them there and, what they're there for, and start to believe there's maybe messages hidden in the books. That basic idea was there all along, an idea that there would be a kind of dramatic structure that would build on the kind of relationship between this character and the books that they're reading. And of course, that implies also us as readers, and me, Matt Madden, as the author of the thing, and all that stuff. That was all pretty much there. And right up to, I had an idea. I knew how it was going to end, even in that early outline. But what I spent, and I basically worked on that outline through the full draft of the book. And then in the last, one good thing about the pandemic for me was that it gave me that extra, 9, 12 months window where publishing was kind of dead. And I wasn't even pitching it for a while, that I was able to really let it sit for a while, get a couple of friends to give it a close read. Jessica, Tom Hart, who gave me some really valuable feedback that gave me the time to go in and catch my breath, tweak some stuff, really rework the ending fairly heavily. In not so much in the basic content of it, but in the sort of the fine tuning of it. That really made it a better book. But no, it's surprising to me to see this initial outline that I'd sketched down, how close my final book matches what I had planned out initially.
And in terms of drawing in the multiple styles that you do, Bob Sikoriak is I think the first cartoonist I ever recorded with, in fact.
Oh, yeah.
And we discussed the notion of him having his own style versus everyone else's that he does so well. And it's one of those almost existential level questions that I've gone back to him off mic to ask about, because style versus, the ability to integrate and incorporate all the other stuff is pretty amazing. When it came to those sort of challenges, were there styles that, you sort of had to grow into, or, ways of aping certain types of art that just weren't, a Matt Madden drawing? How much of a challenge was it, I guess, working in multiple formats?
It's always a challenge, but a fun one. I mean, Bob and I, of course, have a long kind of ongoing conversation over the years about this question. We definitely cover similar terrain. And I feel like, I definitely, Bob, I think both of us, if you see a drawing copying a Bob Kane Batman, you're actually going to tell, most, readers are going to be able to tell, oh, this one was drawn by Bob Sikoriak, that one was drawn by Matt Madden. There's like a basic physiological quality of line that comes through. But I feel like in some ways, I feel like Bob is more at peace with the living in other people's style, even than I am.
His response was, I don't have any interest in self-expression. I don't have an individual style. And I did not follow up at the time, which was a sign of how immature I was as an interviewer. But yeah, that was one of those mind-blowing moments of like, wait, but it's self-expression. This is what you do.
Sure. And I sympathize with that view. And I think, having talked to him about it, I feel like for him, it really is the stuff he's been doing up now, Masterpiece Comics and the Constitution, everything, it really is like a life work. That's like his body of work is to, express cultural ideas through through this combination of vernacular cartooning styles and supposedly high, works of literature and increasingly like political language and stuff like that. So I don't have as cut and dry, a project as that. But I share that, the skepticism about, self-expression and what is a true, personal style when everything is something we learn that's handed down to us that we kind of copy other people until something, some amalgamation of earlier styles becomes, what we are doing now. So there's definitely like a philosophical aspect in that sense to me, like always aping different styles. Another reason is I have so much fun learning how to draw different ways and using different tools and adopting different techniques that I can never seem to settle down to finding. I've tried this sometimes, like in my sketchbook, and I'll be like, all right, I'm going to take, Jose Munoz drawing and a Gary Panter drawing and a Julie Doucet drawing, and I'm just going to draw all three of them and try to mix them up until I come up with my own style that's going to be my perfect, something like that, and I might come up with a cool drawing. I was like, that's great, but that's not what now I need to do something different. I'm always looking for interesting new ways to talk about stuff and to represent stuff. At the same time, one of the things I love and value about comics in particular is the plasticity of it and the elasticity of visual representation, and that you can adjust the style so easily and so radically from one story to the next. You can do a stick figure graphic novel, and then you can do a fully rendered realistic graphic novel. If you put the time into the figure drawing, whatever, or tracing photos, you have that huge range. And that's there's so much possibility there that, I'm always tailoring the drawing style to the story to one extent or another. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the fact that, like in a book like Ex Libris, and of course also Exercise in Style, the creating imaginary different artists and different visual worlds becomes part of the story. So I'm kind of forcing myself into that situation where I'm always creating new stuff. The downside to all of this is that it really slows me down, and it arguably affects my crossover to a wider reading public. I think I was listening to your talk with Josh Shaw last week, and I think he was saying something similar, that his stuff changes a lot from book to book. But, less so even than me, but I think, it was a good point that, like, his stuff, when you're changing your style all the time, it's very hard to keep the general readership's attention. I mean, there's the hardcore comics people will follow what you're doing, but, but
yeah, I could see that being this isn't the look that we're used to from your stuff.
Exactly. And part of me, in the back of my mind, I look at an artist like Louis Trondheim or like Jason, who has developed, very deliberately and very carefully and strategically a clean, simple, easy to work, drawing style that allows them to really concentrate on just telling great stories, cranking out books and not wasting time on like, I need to learn how to perfect this, 18th century engraving hatching style for this one panel. It allows a great mobility. It's like Jack Kerouac with his typewriter roll or something. It's just like this kind of, it really opens up the road to you in a way that I really admire. And every time I start a new story, I'm always like, okay, this one, I'm just going to come up with a very simple style, and I'm just going to hit pedal to the metal. And then something comes up and it's like, well, but I think like, I don't know if I sent you my little mini comic Bridge that came out this past year. That was published by Kush Comics in Latvia as part of their mini Kush series. And
this whole time I've been thinking that Ex Libris is Calvino by way of Hicksville, and you're just corroborating that with every statement.
Absolutely. We can come back to Hicksville in a minute. But anyway, so this other book, Bridge, I feel like is one instance where I just came up with a simple drawing style and tried to stick to it and make it work pretty, organically within the story, with an eye to like, I would like to do a book. In fact, Louis Trondheim is a friend of mine, and he's someone who really likes to needle people and dig at their weak spots. And so he's challenging me. He's challenged me to do a book without any kind of formal constraints or rules to it. So someday I might have to try and do that. But
the stuff you were saying previously, it put me in mind of two Davids in comics. One was Dave Stevens, who apparently once took 6 months to get the back leg of a bulldog right in one panel. The other was a time I saw David Boswell at TCAF talking about Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman, and that if he knew it was going to be a classic, he would have made the nose different. Because that squared off nose is impossible to draw at any angle except dead on. And so he said that was the rate limiting step for more Reed Fleming, was that I gave him that stupid nose at the very beginning. But
right, it's true. I mean, that's the thing, is once you commit to something, you're stuck with it. And if you're not flexible the way I am and always switching it up, then you got to draw that way forever. And I guess there's maybe a underlying fear of that kind of thing. And certainly as a teacher, I've often seen it when I was teaching undergrad at the School of Visual Arts. I would often see these students who are just like, chomping at the bit to start making comics. And we're like, let's do some short exercises. And no, I'm going to start working on this 100-page, story I want to do with these characters I've been working on since in high school. They draw the first panel and they spend 2 weeks, cross-hatching and stippling and getting all the perspective right and making it incredibly detailed. And it looks great. And it's like, okay, that's great. Now you need to do that 9,000 more times at the exact same level of detail and perfection as the first one. So like the Dave Stevens one is actually one that I don't really identify with, because I really try not to be a perfectionist, maybe to a fault. I'm a slow cartoonist just because I'm easily distracted, and even to draw kind of passable. I mean, I'm not going to play the sad sack cartoonist here too much, but it takes me a long time.
You didn't have to say sad sack. It's okay.
It takes me a long time to get a drawing looking decent to a way that I'm basically happy with it. I'm definitely. I think I'm a pretty good visual expressing stuff visually, but I'm not like I've never been a virtuoso drawer, and you don't really need to be for comics. It's one of the great things about the medium. I mean, that goes back to Rodolphe Töpfer and his famous maxim of long lines of, I can't draw that well, but I'm a pretty good writer. I don't have that much way with words, but I can, turn out a pretty good doodle. And that's kind of like the heart of cartooning, I think.
Yeah.
As in terms of that balance that you need.
It was one of the lessons I've got just from taking up drawing in the last year. It turns out that 50 years of comics reading sort of permeated my brain in ways that I didn't realize. There were things that I was drawing and I realized, oh yeah, this is why they do it this way in comics. This is, if I just put these 2 lines here, this will get across everything I need. I don't need to go hyper detailed. So yeah, it's
right. Which is, it's a kind of shorthand, which is great to learn, although that cuts both ways too, because again, and this comes back to the question of style and adopting a style and claiming that you have an original style, because you get these tics from looking at other artists mostly, especially when it comes to cartooning, and you can usually spot the lineage of a cartoonist back to whatever Japanese artists they've been reading, or Robert Crumb, and you look at Robert Crumb and you see L.C. Segar and other cartoonists and his work. That is it's a visual shorthand, that is very powerful, but it can also be restrictive when you're trying to change register, or if you're trying to do a different type of work and you don't want to draw Reed Fleming with a cubical nose for the rest of your life, it's also something I think about a lot, which is the difference. I think about this idea of register a lot, of like they're not so much like high-low art, for example, but that it's a different kind of brain space and a different kind of intent when you're drawing for a comic versus doing a drawing from life or a drawing that you want to put in a gallery. I've been getting Frank Santoro has been doing this newsletter lately called Hype Pup, which you can subscribe to. You can find him on Instagram. Just like is like old school typewritten newsletter about comics and stuff like that. And he was talking about an old friend of his who's a painter, kind of like someone that he looked up to as a painter, and because he's got a fine arts background as well. And she's now trying to learn how to draw comics, and she's having a lot of even though she's like a really good artist, she does everything from painting from models or from photos and stuff. And if you just tell her to like, okay, make up a character of a man looking out a window, she has a lot of trouble. It's a really different kind of brain space, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to how talented you are as a visual artist or your hand to eye skills and so on. It's kind of there's a question of orientation there that it actually is pretty difficult to draw a good stick figure when you're used to drawing people from life all the time.
Yeah, I could imagine. It's well again, my just scant experiments in art have been very illuminating along those lines of things that I can draw well and things that I would need to draw 500 more times to be even passable at drawing. Although,
sure. But you just draw them 500 more times and you'll get passable, and then you'll draw 500 more times. It's great that you're doing it, because like so many, this I think any artist will tell you, especially teachers, the most depressing thing to hear is to hear people, not just adults, but really anyone over like 15 years old being like, oh, I just can't draw to save my life. I even get that from art, design teachers or whatever. When we talk about like, oh, you should have a comics class, and it's like, oh, well, I can't draw. I could never do that.
Oh no, that's a lesson I use. The Flickr album that has every drawing I've done. I just take a picture of it and post it on Flickr, whenever they're done. I tell people who say that when they see my later stuff and say, oh, I can't draw. You can draw. I said, go look at what was 3 weeks earlier, and it looks like cool. a stroke victim regaining function in his hand. Like I couldn't draw a tree. Yeah. And, within 3 or 4 weeks, it's like, oh yeah, no, you figured out shading, depth, et cetera. Yeah. You figured out how to do bark and what not to overdo with bark, which is still killing me. But I live in the woods, and that's why. But yeah, it's one of those things that, Go on.
You should what would be cool is to make like a GIF of that. You get like a sort of a time lapse of like 10 years of drawing compressed into 10 seconds.
Yeah. It's great. Pretty humorous to watch. But what was in that respect, just in any respect, for Ex Libris, the style you found most difficult to crack, both visually and for, I guess incorporating it in terms of the story? And you have the great EC section in there, and I know everybody loves taking a crack at EC comics. But
yeah, and in fact, I'd already done that in Exercise in Style. There's one of my favorite pages in that book, which I called Exorcise in Style, and that was the first time I really kind of sat down and tried to, that in that case, it's a combination of sort of direct copies of like a Jack Davis drawing and a couple of other artists, and then my own attempt to sort of ape the style. But of course, it's something like the EC house style. It's not just the drawing; it's also figuring out the layout and the very heavy text narration boxes. Yeah. I found someone had put online a free font, a downloadable font based on the Leroy lettering system, which are those weird, wonky lettering stencils that they use for the lettering on those old EC books. Yeah. So that took a lot of work, but it was pretty fun. In some ways, the hardest parts were like little fill-in panels. There are a few places where I wanted to have a good variety of different styles. So sometimes I'd be like, well, like there's a sequence that I call this the comics hypothesis, where there's a bunch of there's a sort of philosophical conversation across a series of like kind of a Otto Soglo looking thing, and then kind of a Hanna-Barbera animal cartoon, and then sort of a contemporary YA graphic novel kind of look. And then I wanted to have the last panel. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was looking through the book trying to figure out what I hadn't drawn yet, and I was like, well, I haven't drawn, nor do I know of any examples of like a kind of early 20th century Soviet proletarian comic and what that might look like. So I did this kind of scratchy, vaguely constructivist looking, I guess it has a little bit of that kind of Blauer Reiter school kind of look to it. But that was, kind of a shot in the dark to try and come up with something that stood out from the rest of the book, because there are so many different styles in there already.
It reminded me of the Simpsons bit and I'm dating myself on this one, when Krusty loses the rights to Itchy and Scratchy, so he has to show some like 1940s animation of a worker and Parasite. Right. I got back to him, I was like, what the hell was that? But that weird. Yeah,
exactly.
Anyway, but one of the things that I and this may be just a completely personal response to the book, read it in PDF initially. Mm-hmm. Okay. Read it in print, knocked me out for and I don't know if that's something, just in terms of the reproduction, the size of the pages, the heft of it. But for some reason, the seeing it on screen just doesn't have the same impact as a print version in this one. And I don't know if that's something, given how much you're involved in teaching comics, which also rolls into digital comics, whether that's something you're aware of in the making, whether it's something I'm just overreacting to, or, what's your take on print versus digital, especially regarding this book, I guess? Yeah,
no, absolutely. It's very much an issue with this book. And I agree that it's very unsatisfying to read as a PDF. And the final book has surpassed my expectation. I mean, Tom Kaczynski at Uncivilized did a really great job. I mean, he basically came to me with like this much, it's a larger size than I was even imagining. I was thinking a little bit smaller, but he's like, no, let's do this. We were looking at like the Olivier Schrauen books that Fantagraphics as kind of our model for the sort of size and heft. So I'm really happy with how the book turned out. At the same time, since it is a book about reading and a book about that also uses a lot of first person point of view. So that was another strategy of telling the story, kind of a sort of structural constraint of presenting the story through the eyes of the reader, which creates several layers of tension, because you're on the one hand, you don't know who this person is. On the other hand, in a postmodern sort of way, it puts you in the position of the reader, in the same way that in Calvino's book, the narrator is actually directing you in second person, calling you the reader. Yeah. And then as you read the book, you realize actually he's not talking to you like me, Matt Madden, reading this book. He's talking to a male hypothetical reader who he's calling you, but I'm also the reader. So it's, there's like this kind of like head spinning, again, that sort of turtles all the way down kind of thing going on. But finally, and the real reason I think it works so poorly as a digital book is that I tried to make a lot of use of the page turn, both for kind of reveals and story tension, but also because so much of the action of the book, such as there is people turning pages. But I had to find a way to make that exciting. So there are 4 or 5 places in the book where you're turning the page, you're physically turning the page. You're mimicking what the narrator is doing at that point in the book, or even a character in the book. So there's like this constant back and forth between you, the reader, reading this book, the reader who's reading the comics, and sometimes even the characters within the comics who are turning pages. So there's this constant back and forth between the physical object of the book that I think is really fun, and really needs to be done with the physical object in your hands. And it's too, I'm not at all anti-digital, and it definitely hurts me somewhat that I'm not planning to release like a ebook version of this book, because I don't think that would really make sense. But I love books. I love the physical aspect of books. I spend a lot of time online too, like we all do, and I read stuff on PDF. I read stuff online. But for this particular book, which, to be honest, the sketch, predates, the initial idea predates the internet even being particularly part of our lives. It's, like I said, it probably goes back to like the mid 90s that I initially was inspired to do this. So it wasn't so much meant to be like, I'll show those internet people what a book can do, kind of like challenges.
Ryan Hughes. Oh, I'm sorry. Go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say Ryan Hughes just ran into that with his new novel. We're going to be doing a follow-up soon. The great designer, illustrator, and cartoonist from UK. Mm-hmm. He's got a book out called The Black Locomotive. Just like his previous novel, it uses typography in a lot of different ways. And they tried doing an e-version and they had to pull it because if you change the size of anything, it blows up the entire document. Like there's just no way to get across what he did with a printed physical artifact, in terms of, making a Kindle or e-version of it otherwise. So it's in that case, it's tied into the very nature of type and other things that he's doing, but it's still, there are media that are specific to the stories or the ways we're trying to tell certain things, I guess. Yeah.
And all that kind of stuff just goes to show that, print is here to stay. Like it can coexist with digital. It can, books can still sell, their bookstores are doing, pretty well, even especially through the pandemic. It's like been a way for, indie bookstores to stay afloat with, providing books to their local community and so on. So yeah.
You're down in Philadelphia. What's your favorite bookstore down there?
Well, for comics, definitely Partners and Son. They've been an amazing addition to the scene here. They opened up, I think in the fall of 2019 or something like that, kind of a soft opening. So they've had a tough time of it, but they've really become a focal point for the art comic scene here in town. And they put on a little comics expo a few months ago called the Philly Comics Expo, which will hopefully be repeated next year. And I'm going to be doing a show with them in December of original pages from Ex Libris. Philly is a great bookstore town. We have, in terms of like just classic indie bookstores, Joseph Fox Booksellers is a great shop that I like to go to. We now have a Shakespeare and Company in town, and they called me up the other day and had me come in and sign some stock of Ex Libris, which is finally making it into bookstores.
Supply chains.
Yeah, exactly. We'll touch back on that in a sec. And then there's also a lot of great used bookstores. There's an amazing shop called Brickbat Books in Queen Village that just has just the most refined collection I've ever seen in a used bookstore. Like I was following their Instagram and I had to unfollow it because it was just so enticing. All the stuff that would come through there, you'd want to run in and buy it. But yeah, it's a great bookstore town.
And as long as we're getting into home life and all that, two cartoonist household. Mm-hmm. It's one thing when it's two gag cartoonist households. Like I asked Michael Maslin and his wife, are you deliberately unfunny around each other because you're afraid of stealing, or the other one stealing your jokes? But for this sort of cartooning, having a two cartoonist household, things you've noticed in terms of how you push each other as far as comics go.
It's been nothing but great for us, really. I mean, we've always been very complementary artists and personalities. So, Jessica has been doing, started out doing sort of literary, like La Perdida and Art Babe, kind of more literary and mini comic stuff, and then has migrated into more nonfiction stuff with Out on the Wire book. And at this point, comics are taking a back seat to her coaching company, Autonomous Creative, which has been her main focus the last, really, since we got to Philadelphia, the last 5 or 6 years, helping creative people of all sorts organize their time and get projects done and get stuff out in front of people, which is something that she's always been really good at doing for herself and also teaching people. So because we've been together since 1997, got married in 2000. The whole time we've been, sitting side by side, working on our comics, eventually raising a family, doing 2 textbooks together, series editing the Best American Comics for several years. And I definitely think there's probably advantages to having a couple where you don't do the same thing, and you just, because you come home from work, you don't talk about work, you just find some other common grounds. But with us, comics has always been such a part of our life, and both the rewarding, fun part of our life as well as our work, that it's never felt like taxing to, teach at SVA and work on their textbook, and then come home and read some comic books and talk about artists. So yeah, I mean, it's. Yeah,
I was reading on Twitter somebody talking about the advantages of being in this case, a journalist with a non-journalist spouse. Mm-hmm. And what are you working on? Explaining a story about Substack, and the non-journalist spouse says, wait a second, people are actually paying to get more email? And, and that helped put the journalist, get the journalist into perspective of, oh, wait a second, this whole thing is insane. And that's, I can understand.
I play that role. I think we play that role for each other a bit more now that I'm, after, years of, like, Ex Libris is my first full book since 99 Ways to Tell a Story. That came out in 2005. And I've been working on comics the whole time, but more often kind of short works that have come out in anthologies that no one reads, or mini comics that, I take.
Again, you can just say anthologies.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. But I'm finally at a point in my life where I'm like, all right, I'm back and I'm doing the comics, and this is going to be my main thing from now on. Like I love teaching, and I will keep on teaching, but I don't intend to go back to sort of a semester teaching kind of job anytime soon, if at all. And I've been a stay-at-home dad and making comics for the last 5 or 6 years. And it's worked out great. And meanwhile, Jessica has really been moving in this other direction. She's actually the chair of illustration at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, which is how we ended up here in Philadelphia. So she's juggling that and running this online coaching business. So we're at this point where our paths have diverged enough that we're sort of switching to that kind of role you were just describing, where like she'll tell me something she's working on, she's having trouble with, and I'll have some totally outside and usually fairly skeptical perspective on it that Jeg's, oh yeah, I see what you mean, and it'll help her kind of refine her message.
Yeah. But I imagine the decades together helps with the familiarity aspect of that, and that you're not just taking the piss out of each other's, interests. So.
No, not at all. I mean, and we're not that kind of couple either. We've never been. We're very mutually supportive. We have a very well-oiled family machine. So, it's all good.
Cool. But tell me about teaching and how students or young cartoonists have changed over the years that you've been teaching comics.
I'm not sure how much I can speak to young students, because I haven't taught regularly since 2012. So I taught at SVA from 2001 to 2012, and very intensively. I was teaching 2 or 3 undergrad classes and continuing ed classes in the evening sometimes, and it was great, but it was very exhausting, and ultimately I burned myself out a little, by the beginning of the last decade. But when I first started, the biggest single change I saw in cartooning students in my time at SVA and visiting other schools is that when we started 2001 or so, the students were mostly boys. And by the time we left in 2012, there were slightly more girls than boys. So that gender change has been massive in comics education and comics reading in general, largely because of manga, I think. Which is amazing, and webcomics to some degree as well. So webcomics emerged while we were teaching. I remember probably 2003 or 4. The first student came in who was like an undergrad at art school at School of Visual Arts, and they're like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm already making a living, with my daily webcomic and selling sketches at Comic-Cons I'd never heard of. This whole new world that sort of emerged in parallel to what we were used to." So that's been an interesting thing. And that's another sort of globally, I would say that the comics world has become larger, more diverse, but also more diffuse. So that the comics culture that Jessica and I, and maybe you too, grew up in, it was like defined by mainly by the struggle between the mainstream superhero comics and like Weirdo and Arcade, kind of, and Raw magazine, and then whatever infighting between Raw is for snobs and Weirdo is like the underground one or whatever. And then you're dimly aware that there was like French comics, and in France everyone loves comics. Manga weren't even really there were a couple of manga that came out in the 80s, but it really wasn't a major force until we'd already sort of come of age. Yeah. And now it's the air you breathe. It's like the kids that are growing up now, I mean, my children who are 11 and almost 14 have grown up reading all these YA novels, Raina Telgemeier and Dogman and Captain Underpants, which, by the way, are quite interesting and very formally inventive kids comics. Manga, anime on TV, and also video games, and this whole kind of world of video games and video game playing, and then like YouTube videos about people playing video games creates this whole other visual narrative world that blends into to what was previously a kind of walled off comic book world, And I think that walled off comic book world doesn't really exist anymore, except for people maybe over the age of 40 or something.
Hey, I resemble that remark.
Exactly.
How do you stay? Do the kids help with that? Your kids, I mean, in terms of keeping you apprised, up to date? Relatively, I don't want to say hip because none of us are hip. But.
Yeah, no, we're definitely not hip. And I'm reminded of that. They definitely keep me apprised of that. But yeah, it's good because I've got, a teenage girl and an almost teenage boy, and they're close enough that they're kind of following the same stuff, but with different emphases. My son's more into manga and classic. We have all these books lying around the house. So he systematically reads through all the old Seagar Popeyes and the Little Lulu collections and stuff like that. He's actually probably better educated than I am at this point in like early American newspaper strips. Yeah. And my daughter's reading all the post-apocalyptic novels and getting really into music and TikTok and stuff. So I have to get her out of her headphones to be able to actually hear the music she's listening to. But some of it's quite interesting, and I manage to turn her on to something every once in a while.
And of course, they also play it at some weird frequency that people over the age of 30 can't hear. Right. That's always an issue, or so I've been told. But what I wonder, both with the kids as well as back when you were teaching, conveying what it was like for us when there was no internet and there were these much smaller, less diverse camps within comics. Is that something? Well, okay, my ongoing story of this is the time I met Bob Sikoriak. I guess it was 2012 SPX. Tom Spurgeon called and said, "Oh, come on down. We're all hanging out at the bar." Went downstairs, and it was the Hernandez brothers, Klaus, I think Ware or Bag, and someone else sitting with Tom and Eric Reynolds. And I hid behind Tom. I was just Adrian Tomina. And so I was this is Mount Rushmore. I was, just hiding in a corner, and Bob sat down next to me, introduced himself, and we became pals pretty much on the spot. But a bunch of young cartoonists came in, walked right by our table and just kept walking. And I thought, you guys should have been like tumbling over each other like a slapstick skit that, oh my God, look, these are the greatest cartoons.
Saying we're not worthy, although they wouldn't get that reference either. So probably,
see, we're dating ourselves while dating ourselves. It's terrible. But yeah, that sense of what it was like when there was this, we'll say, pantheon of amazing cartoonists like that versus, I know everybody's got their faves, and, there are all these, I'd say, lesser peaks, I guess, when it comes to Olympus, if that makes sense. But
sure,
conveying to them what it was like having, we waited for an issue of hate, things like that. So,
yeah,
or you just come off as an old fart when you try and do that.
Exactly. I mean, I was going to say I was born in 1968, but to my kids, I'm a boomer. And that's just like, it's like the most dismissive thing they can say to me. And yeah, any kind of like, oh, well, you should have, seen what it was like back then. So yeah, I do get concerned when I meet, especially like, to put it in the comics contest, cartooning students who've never read Chris Ware, you know, and just there's a cultural kind of a shared cultural heritage in America, and obviously it depends on, you know, what country, what language, what, you know, demographic you're from. But for a cartooning class, for example, like Jessica had some students just last year, and they were talking about like world building and design, and she's like, you know, it's just like in Blade Runner. And she looked around the room and just blank expression. She's like, wait, who here's seen Blade Runner? And nobody raised their hand. These are art students who are doing illustration and comics, and a lot of them want to do video game design and stuff like that. And it's just like, you know, part of it makes you want to, you know, panic and sort of wring your hands about the decline of culture. But on the other hand, that's what, you know, adults were saying in the 60s when kids were listening to the Beatles instead of, you know, the Boston Pops, you know. So not to say that Chris Ware is like the Boston Pops, but, you know, you get my point.
Yeah.
So, and the, you know, the plus side is you have a much more level playing field of, you know, all this, controversy in like in the academy in the last, you know, 20, 30 years over the canon, and, you know, who do we read and what are we supposed to get exposed to? There's there's so much more access to so many more different kinds of cultural products and ideas that, you know, in the best of worlds, everyone gets to kind of build their own canon and find their own path into their own heroes or just groups of people that they admire, artists that they like. But the downside of that is like we have much less of a shared culture than we used to. It's like, I feel like I've heard someone saying that they'd met someone who didn't even know who the Simpsons were recently. It's like, you know,
I've heard that about Superman. I think it was Karasik or somebody told me they had a student who literally didn't know who Superman was. Like, didn't know the symbol or anything. And he was just, where do we start a conversation?
Right.
we sort of thought we had all this shared stuff, but yeah, I can imagine. It's well, I mean, I went to, as last week's 3-hour-long episode goes into a little bit, I went to college. I went to Hampshire College in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was all about canon busting and, you know, cultural relativism, basically. And it's very difficult to have a conversation where you don't have that sense of commonality. And I ended up doing 2 years at St. John's College right after that in a great books program where everybody was reading the exact same things. And we were able to sort of build that foundation first and then, you know, go from there, which I guess ties back to you and Sikoriak, that same question of having everything in place and then deciding what you're going to do with it versus the, you know, jumping out and trying to make something without you know, having the building blocks, I guess. Yeah,
that definitely plays into my ethos as an artist. Personally, I'm loath to prescribe this for other people necessarily, but I'm definitely in that sort of, that idea that in order to break rules, you have to learn all the rules first. And it's tough because I still feel like I'm still learning the rule book. You know, I've started breaking a few things here and there from that I have mastered, but I feel, you know, I'm always in a process of learning and reading and practicing and stuff. And I do feel like that is the most fruitful way to advance, to like look forward and backward at the same time, basically.
Making textbooks, was that a concern or a challenge? The fear of
absolutely,
sort of creating rules or, you know, inadvertently overemphasizing.
Yeah. I don't think we did. Well, yeah, maybe inadvertently. We definitely. So the two textbooks that Jessica and I did, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, came out in 2008. And Mastering Comics came out in 2012, I think, 2011 maybe. And we tried really hard in those books to give as much practical. We really thought of them as handbooks more than textbooks, in the sense that they're manual. They're things you can use practically. And we tried to avoid any kind of prescriptive stuff. We're saying this is how you need to do this. We're saying like, well, the Ames lettering guide. This is like the kind of like iconic idea of an obsolete tool at this point in cartooning, but which a lot of people still use. And a lot of cartoonists want to know, like, all right, how to up until 2000 even. 1990, certainly, any cartoonist would have this sort of arsenal of tools that were basically drafting tools from the engineering and architecture industry dating back to only 50 years before that. It's actually not. It's all like sort of very mid 20th century stuff. The ruling pen and the Ames lettering guide, T-squares and triangles and all this stuff you would use to lay out pages and draw in India ink on Bristol board, because that's what would reproduce best on cheap newsprint paper, and so we were aware of that going into the book, that we're teaching something that is based on printing technology that is already getting obsolete. 2000, like I said, 2007, 2011, we're full on web internet 2.0 mode at this point. Not so far ahead that we could say with any certainty like what you should do with webcomics. So like we deliberately avoided saying much about digital cartooning because we didn't know enough ourselves, and because it was evolving.
Tumblr is the future. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we just tried to make it. And at this point, I feel like I'm very proud of those books. And I feel like they are, at this point, like as much a historical repository of knowledge of different kinds of techniques for drawing and inking, visual storytelling, and doing stuff by hand in a way that you don't have to do. And we make that clear, I think. And certainly in my years as a teacher, again, from the early 2000s, I would teach an ink drawing class. So that was very much a materials class where we would teach them using different kinds of nibs and brushes and doing ink washes and learning how to make a gradient and different values and stuff like that. And I do find that stuff's very valuable. But by the last, and now when I teach workshops, half the kids, they're drawing on tablets. So, and that, it kind of galled me at first, but after a while I was like, this is the new, nib Hunt 102 and, right. Black Magic, Higgins ink, Black Magic ink, that young cartoonists are using. So yeah, go with it. And I've been drawing a lot with Procreate, and I find it's a pretty amazing program to use on the iPad or on a tablet.
Do you use one of those texture covers or anything? Because I've tried drawing, and again, I'm just starting out with drawing, but when I've tried on an iPad, I just can't do it.
Yeah. No, I definitely think the texture pad helps. I think they're all kind of the same. Like I got one that was supposed to be like, it's a paper-like finish. You won't believe it. And I would draw it a bit, and it's like, this is just kind of like the one that I got at Staples for $1. So I don't think it matters too much, but yeah, having some kind of toothy finish there for the Apple Pencil or the stylus to react to is definitely helps, I think. Because drawing straight on glass is a little strange.
Yeah. And again, you guys have all the experience with this stuff, but is it something you plan on sticking with, or are you still primarily pen and ink? Or
time will tell. Basically what I'm doing now is that I'm using Procreate on the iPad a lot for penciling and sketching stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty. I make little templates. I can bring a sort of penciled, laid out page. I can even. It's a whole long conversation, but Jessica and I both have adopted Alison Bechdel's really great dynamic writing method of writing her comics in a design program. So I'll lay out my pages in InDesign, which allows me to work on layout and pacing and page turns at the same time I'm developing dialogue and sketches. And at any point, I can export one of those pages as a PDF into Procreate. And I've got my panel borders and my word placed, and then I can just start doodling on a new layer and build up the pencils that way. But then I will print that out enlarge it, print it out, and lightbox that on the Bristol board. And then I go back to the traditional methods using nib pens, watercolor brush, black ink.
And you scoff when your kids call you a boomer. I'm just kidding.
I
use all this advanced technology so I can get back to Bristol board. And
exactly, yeah.
Tell me, it's something I'm always curious about, especially given that Mount Rushmore comparison or story I just told. The sense of belonging in comics when you felt you were actually, we'll say, a peer. When you felt that, holy crap, I actually fit in here, which also leads to the mirror question of, do you remember freaking the hell out around any of your comics heroes?
Well,
most people have a weird Crumb story, but go on.
I've actually never met Robert Crumb. I would probably have a weird Crumb story if I had. But I'm trying to think if anyone has.
Like Shannon Wheeler had this great moment where Eddie Campbell told him, "Oh, you're Shannon Wheeler. I love your stuff," not realizing that it was him that evening when they were hanging out, and he just, "Oh my God, Eddie Campbell," and just yeah. But that feeling that you were part of comics for real.
Very much from the get-go. I mean, comics, and again, this is, I think it's true now over the internet in a more diffuse way, but to meet people who were making comics in the late 80s, early 90s was so powerful and meaningful. And it's really why I started making comics, was that I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as an undergrad, and I met Cherry Laban, who back then was doing political cartoons at the Ann Arbor paper. And I got to know him, and he later on did Unsupervised Existence with Last Gasp and Fantagraphics and so on. But at that point, he was just doing political cartoons, and he was making these mini comics, which I'd never heard of the concept. And so he showed me what he was doing, and he's like, "Yeah, you should. It's really easy. You just draw a story, and you just take it to Kinko's and get it photocopied." And then he handed me a couple of copies of Fact Sheet 5. Which you might remember.
Oh yeah, and then Maximum Rock and Roll. Yeah,
yeah. It was the Maximum Rock and Roll for zines and comics, and this sort of clearinghouse of just like page after page of 7-point print, or if not smaller, with addresses and information about mini comics and zines and cassettes and all kinds of stuff, and that really got me to just start, drawing my own comics. And I'd already been doodling a little bit, but that made me commit to actually making a mini comic. And then I started hanging out with him and Matt Feazell, who did the amazing Cynical Man mini comics, which was really one of the pioneer mini comics of the early 80s. And he was living in Ypsilanti at the time. He's still in the Detroit area, in Hamtramck. But I started hanging out with those guys. They took me to my first Chicago Comic-Con a few years later. And actually, that's that one moment of feeling like I've been part of the comics club is that I was with Matt Feazell, and we were at this, I forget where it was at some hotel out near the airport back then, out near O'Hare, and we were at the bar, and Bob Burden walks by, Flaming Carrot Comics, and he knows Matt from, they've both been in the scene for a while, and Matt's like, "Oh, I want you to meet my friend Matt Madden. He's going to be a cartoonist." And Bob Burden, "Oh, that's great. Let me buy you a beer." And that felt like I was being, inaugurated, bought a beer by the creator of Flaming Carrot. Was like definitely a moment of feeling like, okay, I'm here now. I'm a cartoonist for real.
Well, I've heard stories of Bob's stories, so all things considered, you got off pretty easy on that. I think Tom Spurgeon used to share funny Bob Burden stories with me, but
that sounds like you should save that for another podcast, maybe.
Yeah, I think we will. We can go into a whole Tom thing on the side also, but there's some Bob stories. He and Jaime Hernandez were slinging them back and forth at the last TCAF we got to go to. So, yeah, it's there are some personalities in this.
This, for sure.
This sector. So, I guess this is a weird last question. Where's home for you? Do you have a sense of home, or is it wherever your pen is, basically?
Home has definitely been a carried on my back kind of thing for most of my life. The longest I've lived somewhere is probably our Brooklyn years, where we were in New York for 12 years. And other than that, the average has been about 5 years. I've moved around a lot my whole life. I was born in New York City, lived in Paris for 5 years when I was a kid, then we were in the Connecticut suburbs. And then, boarding school, college, transferred from a small college to Ann Arbor, ended up in Texas, so I've always been sort of carried my home with me. And, it was fairly deliberate. I consider myself pretty cosmopolitan in that sense, that I want to be a world citizen. I like to travel. Jessica and I, of course, spent 2 years in Mexico in the late 90s, which were very formative years for both of us, and led to relationships and friendships that we still have to this day. And then we spent 4 years in France just before we came to Philadelphia in Angoulême, doing the residency at the Maison des Auteurs. So we've really gotten used to kind of carrying our lives with us, and being a pretty self-sustaining unit. And with our kids too. I mean, our kids have lived in 2 countries, 3 cities, and probably 5 or 6 different houses by now. So that said, we've been in Philadelphia now for 5 years, and we like it a lot here. The kids are, getting ready to go to high school, and I think it's a great place to live, and I like being close to New York, but not in New York anymore. So, we'll see. I hesitate to predict, because in our lives have often, stuff has come up and shifted our fortunes, mostly in interesting ways. So, but the plan is to stay in Philadelphia, long term.
But as the last 2 years have taught us, the words long term and foreseeable future don't really have any meaning. So
sure, exactly. I will say that the more when I was younger, I was always eager to move and go somewhere new and try out something different. And the older I get, even having the support of, being together with Jessica and with our kids, it definitely takes a toll. Like the time it takes you to move to a new place and
pack up all the comics.
Not yet. Well, that is its own nightmare, the logistics of moving. But just socially and psychologically getting set up in a new place and starting to feel like you live there. I find it takes at least 4 or 5 years to really start to feel at home someplace. And like I said, I tend to move every 4 or 5 years. So
as soon as I get to know you, you're out of there.
Yeah. There are places I've left and I'm like, oh, I was just getting comfortable there. So, I'm really, at this point in my life, I'm very reluctant to do that. Like just for the thrill of it, or for the adventure, like we did when we, went to Mexico or moved to France for 4 years. I want to have a stable base, a more fixed home, fixed address, and be able to just, build my life here and have a kind of rootedness that I have not had, in the past.
And live up to the Trondheim challenge and make your mega book without formal challenges.
Yeah, I definitely need the time and the concentration to be able to pull that off, for sure.
Oh, real last question. Who are you reading? Prose, comics, whatever. Don't draw a blank because you'll feel stupid.
I go through peaks and valleys of reading, and I'm at a kind of a low point right now, but I've been slowly working my way through China Miéville's book, The City in the City, which is a speculative fiction that I find really fascinating. It's sort of inspired, I think, by Berlin before the wall fell. But it's a story about these 2 cities that are coexist in the same space, and through long, wars and historical trauma, the citizens of both cities are trained to ignore each other and pretend like they can't even see their neighbors, or else they'll be taken away by a underground KGB, CIA type of institution called Breach. So you'll be walking down the street and you're kind of vaguely aware of sort of blurriness off to your right side, but you can't acknowledge that that's actually another city on the other side of the street. Huh. And it's a really amazing kind of visual metaphor for everything from, divided cities like Berlin to, the Middle East, to just gentrification and the way that we divide up our urban spaces into things that we say like, yes, this is the city I live in, no, I'm going to pretend I'm not seeing that homeless guy over there, because that's not the city I want to live in. This way that we were able to train our brains to acknowledge and ignore selectively information is a really powerful metaphor.
And sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of some comics that I've read recently. Well, I recently read The Magic Pen, speaking of Dylan Horrocks. I guess
we just get back to Hicksville and all that.
Yeah. So, yeah, obviously Hicksville was a huge influence on me, and I think was really the more than any other comic that I read, the one that got me wanting to explore that elasticity of styles in my own comics, the way that as the Hicksville story develops, you get all these different characters and comics by other artists that are excerpted, and the amount of fun he was clearly having with that really inspired me. And as I was working, well into working on Ex Libris, I got wind that he had a new book out called Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen. And just from the title alone, I was like, all right, I'm not going to read that until I've already finished my book, because I bet it has overlap with Ex Libris. And so I finally read that for the first time just a few months ago, and I really enjoyed it. It's definitely not a whole lot of overlap with Ex Libris, but definitely kind of a cousin work of sorts that I don't know if you've read it yet, but it's
I devour anything by Dylan the moment it's available.
Sure, me too. So he definitely plays in a more fraught and politicized sort of way with the relationship of the artist to their creations. But I thought it was funny that there are certain accidental, maybe not so accidental, coincidental overlaps in drawing styles. Like there's, of course, like a manga schoolgirl character, which, makes an appearance in Ex Libris, and even a sort of funny kind of retro, in his case, it's sort of the Martians and, Mars girls and Venus girls. And they're sort of like these scantily clad, kind of pulp novel, cover art kind of characters that are a recurring sort of imaginary world in Magic Pen. And I did something very similar in Ex Libris with the Moon Girls little excerpt towards the end of a bunch of, a rebellion of kind of slave girls on the moon in some sort of hypothetical future.
But managed to not read it before getting rolling with Ex Libris.
Oh yeah, no. So I when I finished my final revisions on Ex Libris, I finally got hold of Magic Pen and just read it. Yeah, and I read it like maybe 3 months ago for the first time. So
cool. And otherwise, slowing down with comics and prose for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading comics by so Partners in Sun is sort of my source for picking up arty comics and stuff by local artists. I know this is very nepotistic, but I'm a huge fan of Tom Hart's new stuff. The Bee is Dying.
Oh yeah,
comics are great. He's making it as hard as possible for anyone to actually find and buy those things. But look him up online and bug him and get him to send you some, because that's some of his best stuff yet, I think. When I think of a comic that I've read, I probably read it a year ago now, but a book that I come back to a lot that really stuck with me is by Aisha Franz, who's a German artist, and she has a book called Aisha is Missing, I think it is, from this German publisher called Colorama. And it was just such a unusual book. It's printed as a vertical, almost like a notebook. It's got a plastic spiral binding, and it's sort of you flip it up like an old police reporter's notebook, and each page is one panel. And you realize after a while, it's a very physical handheld object, but it also is about the size of a smartphone. And Aisha, the character, finds that she's become a ghost somehow. She's died, and she's exploring these environments. And eventually she meets these other ghosts who take her in, and they all have like Instagram accounts. It's a really strange, it's just like one of those stories that, almost like a Murakami short story or something, where it just has these sudden twists and turns that are very surprising, and yet they feel totally inevitable and natural. So that's a really one that I would recommend looking up if you can find it.
Cool. Because that's been part of my thing with doing the podcast during the pandemic, is that I've realized without festivals and without going out, you miss a lot.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
It's been important. I missed a couple of issues of Love and Rockets at one point. I'm like, yeah, I guess I should have been checking on the Fantagraphics site, because otherwise I would have been getting them at festivals and yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's been among the tough things people have to deal with the pandemic. My having to do podcasts remotely and find comics is really low on the scale of this stuff. But,
Right.
But yeah, over 20 months, it has been a little weird. But I'm hoping we can get together at a festival sometime soon. Are you
that'd be great. Well, listen, Ex Libris so the book is, we talked about supply chains earlier, and I consider myself very lucky because Tom Kaczynski had wind of this back in July when we were getting ready to go to print, and we actually brought the print date ahead by a couple of weeks. So the book's actually been printed since early August, and it was actually shipped from China in August. They were like, also got an earlier boat out of China. And even still, it got stuck in the famous, photos in the news of containers stacked up at the Port of Los Angeles for a couple of weeks. But at this point, the whole print run is in Tennessee at the Ingram warehouse, and it's being shipped out to bookstores. Like I said, at least one store here in Philadelphia, Shakespeare and Company, got some copies. And people who we had a very fun and successful pre-order campaign that I made a little art print for that I signed a couple weeks ago. And so Tom is fulfilling those orders. But it's definitely been frustrating because I haven't been able to set up a lot of live events because of Delta and all the people who have enabled Delta.
Yeah. We'll just keep that to ourselves.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Just leave that there. But which is just to say that, I'm definitely planning on doing more events next year. And either way, considering this is my first full book of my own stuff in a long time, and I have the luxury of being able to spend significant time over the coming year doing events. So I'm hoping, in the new year, I'll set up some more events, maybe some more festival visits. I also have French and Spanish editions coming out probably in 2022. So I might actually make it over to Europe, which would be a thrill as well. But we'll see. But yeah, definitely I'm going to try be hitting the festival circuit again as that starts to open up, and maybe do some signing stuff in New York. I've been talking to Gabe at Desert Island. He's not ready to start doing events yet, but I'll at least go sign some stock at some point.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to your Tree of Life Terrence Malick phase where like there's a big gap, and then all of a sudden you're just putting out work every year or two, and
well, that's where I feel like I'm at. I mean, luckily I've had a few kind of role models over the years. One of them being Charles Burns, who's here in Philadelphia, and when Jessica and I were first in New York, we have a friend here in Philly that we would come and visit in the early 2000s before we had kids. And we would just kind of like cold call Charles. And I mean, we'd met him at convention and stuff, but we would just sort of like invite ourselves over and, hey, we're coming to visit your studio. And he's actually where I learned a lot of my technique of tracing and redrawing, learning from how he builds up those drawings was very informative to me. But at that time, we're talking, early mid 2000s, he was about halfway through the Black Hole run. And, you may remember that a lot of those, like he was one of those artists that at that time, he wasn't really busy doing comics. Like for a lot of the 90s, he just kind of, I knew him he was doing a lot of illustration work, supporting his family. He has 2 kids, and not doing comics. Like Black Candy, when Black Hole started to show up, it was like, oh my God, Charles Burns doing a comic again. I remember that feeling like, oh, I thought he was done with comics, but he wasn't done. He was just, being an adult and raising his family and had other stuff to do. Comics don't make money.
Entertainment Weekly pays better than Fanta,
Oh, exactly, yeah, and OK Cola and stuff like that. So I realized, at a certain point, thinking back at that time, like, and since then he's been enormously productive. He's done all, the trilogy of kind of real experimental comics and the Black Hole collection, movie and production, and development. I don't know if that's ever going to happen or not, but I realized recently that when we were visiting him back then, he was at the stage that we're at now, where like his kids are teenagers, they're getting older. He's got a bit more free time, financially things are pretty stable. And, oh, wow, I can start making comics again, and I know quite a few people like that that have, and certainly, for women and, people who have families to run, like you can't be doing graphic novels when you're, in your 40s and you've got 2 or 3 children and you're a single parent, So I think it's exciting to see people come back to it in their 50s or even older, or even start. There are people who are just starting now. Emile Ferris got a pretty late start in comics. She's doing great stuff. It's like there's no particular start or end time.
I can guarantee you will not be saying the same thing about me in 5 to 10 years, but I could still keep that in the back of my brain. So.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, this whole boomer thing. It's like, I think one thing I hope is the case is that in our lifetime, the dominance of teens and adolescent culture and the overvalorization of youth is sort of coming to an end, or at least getting absorbed into a larger idea of how culture works. I mean, I remember with Shame when I was maybe 13 or 14, and the Rolling Stones were going on tour, and how me and my friends were like, oh my God, I can't believe those old boomers are like going on tour. They're like so old. I even did a caricature of like Mick Jagger in a wheelchair holding a microphone. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that a couple of years ago, and I looked it up on the dates on Wikipedia, like it was 1982. He was like 44 years old.
Oh, yeah. The traveling Wilburys were all under 50.
Yeah, exactly. It was like,
yeah.
And here we are, 20, 30 years later, and these guys are still doing stuff. And so, some of it's really great, So I take a lot of heart in that kind of that longevity that people have shown.
Well, I'm glad you stuck with this one and came out with Ex Libris, whatever age it shows up in. So
thanks.
Yeah,
thanks definitely more to come. So
I'm looking forward to it, Matt. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Gil.
And that was Matt Madden. Go check out his great new book, Ex Libris, from Uncivilized Books. That's EX space LIBRIS. It really is a blast, and I hope I managed to convey just how much I enjoyed it and how much I've thought about it since finishing it. And also why it needs to be a print-only book, so don't complain about not being able to get it on your Kindle or Comixology or whatever. You should also visit Matt's site, mattmadden.com, MattMadden, to find out more about his comics, teaching, and other work, as well as his upcoming exhibition of his pages from Ex Libris at Partners and Son in Philadelphia. That starts in early December. Again, 2021 for those of you time shifting. You should also follow Matt on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, where he's all under the same name of M. Madden Comics, all one word. And I'll have links to that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling other people about it. You can also tell me what you like and don't like about the show, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or music or comic or piece of theater or art you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, DM on some of the platforms like Instagram and Twitter, postcards, letters, or my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in a conversation with me. And the messages can only be up to 3 minutes long. So keep that in mind. And if it's a message that you'd like me to include in an upcoming episode, let me know. I won't include something without the speaker's approval. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I'm doing just fine. My expenses are really low. I wish if you have resources or money or time, whatever, that you help other people. There are individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and other crowdfunding sources like that. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election registration funds. We're getting to the end of the year, so people are making contributions as part of their tax write-offs. You might look at institutions that mean something to you and that could use your support, and give them some help. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/May4th. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.